Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar about the cost of living crisis and how it's affecting football clubs and fans. My name is Karl-Erik Moberg. I'm your host for the next half an hour or so, and I'm just as eager as you to learn more about today's topic. And to teach us, we've invited Nancy Frostick. Welcome, Nancy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Great to have you. So, Nancy has been covering English football outside the Premier League for The Athletic since the website launch in the UK in 2019. And she was also previously Sheffield Wednesday's correspondent for the site and also for the newspaper, The Star in Sheffield. So we're super happy to have you with us this morning, as I said. Great. So before we start, Nancy, do you mind sharing with us and the viewers, how do you gather insights when you write your articles?
Yeah, a lot of it just comes from being in the right place at the right time, spending a lot of time at matches, building up contacts, getting to know fans at different clubs. Twitter is really useful, especially when I want to speak to fans and find out how they're feeling, because I cover quite a big patch at the moment, so it can be anywhere from the north of the country all the way down to Devon and Cornwall in the south. So social media is brilliant for that, but also, yeah, the best way is to be out there at the games, speaking to the chief execs, speaking to people in charge of all the backroom stuff, the coaches, and that's the main way, really, being a friendly face around all the different grounds in the country.
Being a friendly face. I completely agree with you on that one. Always works. So, and thank you. I'm really looking forward to having this discussion with you today and to learn from you, Nancy. And we're ready to kick off shortly. But before we do that, let's give the viewers some factual information about this webinar today. So, these two nice faces will be answering questions during today's webinar. They will be on the chat and they're happy to answer every question you might have. Of course, we'll also be available after this webinar if there's things you think about after today's run through. And then, like mentioned in the invitation, and again, thank you for participating. We will cover the following at this webinar: the football pyramid. For those who don't know how that works in England, I'm sure many does, but still interesting to learn. The energy crisis, which is a topic on everyone's mouth these days, all over Europe. Increased offering to fans during the crisis. What can clubs do to offset and to increase sales? The 3 p.m. broadcast blackout and opportunities for new revenue streams. Very interesting to learn about. And then finally, to finish things off, we'll have 3 key takeaways from you, Nancy. So let's start. The football pyramid. So, Nancy, can you please give our listeners an introduction of how the league system works from the championship and downwards?
Yeah, sure. So obviously the Premier League is probably so well known, but there's a really healthy football scene below that in England. So Championship is the second tier, and below that you then got League One and League Two, and they're operated under the EFL. So they are all professional leagues, and then below that, so tiers 5, 6 and 7 are the National League North and National League South. So they're semi-professional. The National League itself is professional, and we'd call them non-league football here. So the aim for lots of the National League clubs is to get into the EFL and progress up the top 4 leagues. But below that, then you go to regional leagues, and that's more amateur or grassroots levels below that. So it's quite a big pyramid, but it's very healthy. You can get big attendances even much further down, tiers 5 and below.
Amazing. We're going to talk more about that later in this webinar as well. So if you look at the championship, right, which is a big league, what's the difference between the biggest and the smallest clubs, just to give us an idea of the range?
It can be quite broad because you get those clubs that have just come out of the Premier League, in some case very big clubs with lots of history. So the biggest club in terms of attendance at the moment in the Championship would be Sunderland. Stadium of Light holds, I think, 49,000. Middlesbrough about 34,000 at the Riverside, which are, you know, huge grounds. Down to the other end of things, clubs like Luton and Rotherham, 10 to 12,000 capacity, and historically they've done very well, but they're just from smaller cities, smaller towns, so a slightly smaller stadium and fan base on the whole.
Got it. So how about League One, League Two, and the National League? I mean, can you mention any names and numbers from those leagues, just to so we understand what's at stake at League 3, 4, 5, etc.?
Yeah, so if your team is unlucky enough to get relegated from the Championship to League One, the rough estimate in terms of financial drop-off is an immediate drop-off of about £7 million a year because of the TV revenue. The Championship's the most shown of the 3 EFL divisions on TV, so they get the biggest share of the TV revenue. So your financials are kind of down straight away. But there are some really big clubs in League One at the moment, so Sheffield Wednesday, Derby County, Ipswich Town, who have had massive history in English football and in Europe as well, in European competitions. So they'll be able to get big attendances. We've seen a couple of times this season 30,000 plus attendances at some of their games. But you do also get some quite small teams that overachieve, so kind of the likes of maybe 9,000 attendances, the likes of Accrington Stanley, some smaller teams that probably aren't as well heard of. And then again in League One, you're probably looking, Bradford City would be the biggest club there, about 25,000 attendance because they've just fallen through the leagues, and some smaller teams, Harrogate Town, about 5,000 is their capacity. But the kind of financial benefit of coming up from National League, where Wrexham play, and they're obviously well known at the moment, it's about £1 million, that difference to coming into the EFL, and you'll probably see jumps then of about 3 million into the next league, and that's 7 million into the Championship. So there's a lot at stake.
Interesting and big numbers for sure. But thank you, very interesting for us to learn more and understand. A topic that's huge at the moment is the energy crisis, and that is something that's affecting all these clubs. But let's talk about the lower league clubs and their energy bills. How has this season been compared to previous season when it comes to that part of the business, to put it that way?
It's been a challenge for them. I've been speaking to a few clubs, and one National League club that I spoke to, you know, they said that this year their energy bills just for the winter periods were £25,000, which is what the entire season cost them last year for gas and electricity, and they still have the March to May kind of payments due. So that was about a 30% rise on the previous year, I think, just for that one period, kind of broken down. So just for gas and electricity, that's huge, but also, you know, there's challenges in terms of raw materials for pitch maintenance, you know, grass, seed, sand, that sort of thing. So there's a team that I spoke to at level 9 of the pyramid, so very far down, but they were saying that for those materials to maintain the pitch is about 35% higher this year than last year, and a lot of that's tied to the troubles in Ukraine and kind of a lot of the raw materials that come from there. And elsewhere, again, some clubs in Scotland I've been in touch with, and their bills have doubled as well. So it's a huge amount. It doesn't matter what your budget is. Shrewsbury Town in League One, their bills this year were £100,000 more than last year. Other teams, you know, the figure is smaller, but compared to their overall revenue, it's huge. So it's having a real impact.
Yes, of course. I mean, it's a huge difference. But what are the clubs doing to offset this? Any examples?
They're having to be quite smart, really. So some of the clubs, when they're maintaining the pitch, for example, they're choosing to only do maintenance on the most played on areas of the pitch. So they might not be doing the whole pitch just to try and reduce the amount of materials they're using. other teams lower down the pyramid, so not the EFL, they decided against this in the EFL, but in some of the regional leagues they've moved the kickoff time earlier so that they're not using the floodlights for as long. And then others, they've just had to look for more investment or even put the ticket prices up. And you've seen that in clubs like Tranmere Rovers in League Two. They recently announced their season ticket prices were going up, and they acknowledged the cost of living crisis and the energy crisis in that as a thing that they're a challenge that they're facing, but also that's something that they know their fans are facing. So it was quite apologetic almost in a way that they'd put the prices up. So for some teams, that's the only choice really.
And I mean, this affects both sides, as you're saying, right? The club and the fans. And it's a problem for both.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, for fans, football is quite often the last thing they want to compromise on. That the government here have helped in terms of the energy prices for domestic use by providing some financial support to every household in the country, but they've also done the same for business. But a lot of football clubs don't qualify under the rules, so that's been a challenge for the clubs. But for fans, it's, you know, it's affecting whether they choose to go to away matches because of how much petrol it might take to get to away games, or even just, you know, the rise in ticket price. They might not be able to factor that in for next year, for next season, even if things do improve. You know, they're having to renew now, so it's quite a challenging time. And I imagine that, you know, it's a difficult position for people that really love their club to make that choice.
Which brings us over to the next topic on increased offering to the fans. What can the club do? And I mean, how important is the match day ticket or the season ticket for a lower league fan? You mentioned they're not willing to sacrifice much, but can you give us an idea of how important it actually is?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at some of the attendances, so in the National League, which is the 5th tier, again, we've seen obviously Wrexham are popular at the moment and they're in the headlines because of their owners and the Disney documentary. But Notts County in that league get around 9 or 10,000 fans every week, which for the 5th tier is amazing. Chesterfield, similarly big attendances there. So to their towns, you know, these football clubs are everything. They're all that people will think about all week at work, and really it's kind of a lot of what they might do in terms of you know, what they might offer at a game to fans is rooted in the community, maybe in the suppliers they use, or, you know, the fan zones they operate and things like that. So people will go to the game to support the town as much as the team.
Yeah, I mean, the game day experience as well. You obviously there is a cost of living crisis going on, and it's affecting the fans, and they don't have limitless amounts to spend at a football game or match. But we've been seeing other places, right? Looking at the United States, for example, where clubs are wrapping in food, drinks, they're having family zones, etc. Do you think that it is a market now still to increase these revenue streams with new packages and more on the table for the fans? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's the way that a lot of forward-thinking clubs are going. You know, the smart clubs are thinking about this, I think, because essentially the longer you get the fans in the stadium, or, you know, in the turnstiles or whatever, the more money they're probably going to either want or need to spend whilst they're there. And it makes sense for clubs to have these good offerings, like you mentioned, it's from American sports. You know, we're seeing that, especially the clubs that have American owners, they're immediately doing these things. It's one of the first things they do, because, you know, if the food and drink offering is really good, people will want to get to the game early. And you know, we have quite a strong away fan culture here. You know, you will get lots of traveling away fans, even though it's a bit more at risk now because of the cost of living crisis. But you know, people will travel in numbers, and whereas they might have chosen to go to the pub before, if you're serving really good local beers or something inside the ground, they're going to want to get in early. And so it's just the smart way I think a lot of clubs are thinking that they can just make a bit more revenue and just give fans a bit more value for money, whether they add a free drink onto a ticket price or something. It just encourages people to come back as well, I think.
Yeah, maybe they're going to have that beer anyway, and might as well have it at the stadium, right?
Yeah, exactly that.
So moving over to the 3 p.m. broadcast blackout, which basically we're talking about streaming, was a big thing during COVID. All the streaming platform broke all records, right? And let's look at this as a missed revenue opportunity for a lot of lower league clubs. And just for reference, we launched ticketingpodcast.com a couple of weeks ago, and you mentioned Wrexham. We actually interviewed Peter Wynn, who's the ticketing and membership manager, or head of tickets and membership at Wrexham, and he told us the story of the club, which was incredibly exciting to listen to. You mentioned the Disney documentary, but I mean, they're now selling out the racecourse ground in minutes on each of their home fixtures. However, they're almost impossible to watch on TV. So who benefits from the current streaming structure in the EFL today?
So in terms of the EFL streaming structure, it's a system called iFollow, and each team will sell passes for a game. In terms of fans, it's international fans that will benefit from that because of the 3 p.m. broadcast blackout. If it's a midweek evening game, domestic fans can watch the game, but if it's a Saturday match at 3 o'clock, only the international fans can physically watch the game through the platform, and so the revenue goes to the team that you buy the pass off. So in some cases, you might get some smaller teams who are hosting a much bigger team, but they will only get the money from the number of passes they sell through their website. So if you're a Sheffield Wednesday fan and you're playing Accrington, you're probably going to buy the pass from Sheffield Wednesday because it makes sense. So Sheffield Wednesday might get lots of revenue because they might have lots of international fans. And Accrington, even though they're putting it on, they're hosting the game, and normally if you were going and paying for a ticket, they would get the money. They only get their chunk of that. So some of the smaller clubs aren't always so happy about how the money's split up.
But historically, I mean, what's the reason behind this blackout? What's the history behind it?
I think it's always been about protecting match-going fans. So they obviously the TV deals have become so lucrative, and there's so many games on TV now, but there's always this just desire to preserve kind of match-going culture and people being willing to go and pay, because you might be able to buy a Sky Sports package for, I don't know, £50 maybe a month. I don't actually know how much they are, but you can watch an unlimited amount of games, whereas that might be 2 or 3 physical matches at an EFL team. So it's just about preserving that.
And how do you think the Wrexham documentary, since you mentioned that in the beginning, how big of effect do you think that's given to streaming?
Massive, yeah. It's been huge because in the National League, where Wrexham are playing, the sort of the streaming model, well, there wasn't really a streaming platform for it. So I think Ryan Reynolds was quite outspoken about, being able to watch games. They suddenly have this surge of American fans, particularly American fans, because they've been watching it through Disney, and they had nowhere to watch the game. So the National League has now launched its own streaming platform, and I think the number of match passes they've sold each time is through the roof. So again, it's just kind of, it's smart business to set it up, but it just needed someone to go, why aren't we doing this? And so now, it seems to be working well. So Wrexham, and kind of maybe again that American influence of the way that they do sport is having a benefit. If not for the rest of the league, definitely for Wrexham.
Yeah, and it's a great content as well.
Yeah, it's the documentary itself is brilliant, and the football in that league is so good. It's really worth a watch.
I agree 100%. So moving back to where we started a little bit, and the clubs are affected. We mentioned power bills, prices. Do you think anyone will go into administration due to this?
I mean, if not solely because of it, it'll definitely be a factor. We're already seeing in the past few weeks a couple of teams struggling here. Wigan have just had a 3-point deduction for not paying their players' wages on time, I think for the 3rd month in a row. So they've had a points deduction. There's a few other of the clubs where either they've had to cut back maybe on the players they signed in January, or there's just kind of rumours at the moment about long-term financial security. And that's because, you know, on the whole, a lot of, especially championship clubs, are kind of permanently in debt, and that's just the way that they're operated. So this sort of thing, a crisis like the pandemic, or now this on top of that, it can, you know, it can really throw a club off course. So yeah, I think it'll definitely be a contributing factor, particularly for smaller clubs where the margins are a lot smaller and they really rely on fans paying to attend the games, because that's where, the lower down the leagues you go, that's where the most of their revenue will come from, just because they're not on TV as much.
No, it'll be interesting to follow for sure, and obviously we will hope that these clubs will get out stronger than ever. And I think we can conclude that business as usual is far from business as usual these days in English football, and we'll see changes for sure after such a crisis. I mean, one of the changes, my 2 cents, is that we'll have innovation. People, the clubs will have to be more innovative, and more packages for clubs. They have to utilize customer data stronger, think different when it comes to ticketing as well. So yeah, it'll be interesting to follow for sure. But Nancy, you are the expert, and I've been looking forward to this part of the webinar. And if you were to sum up your 3 key takeaways, either from this conversation or on the macro picture in general, what would that be?
So I think firstly, I would say, if you look at the attendance figures, particularly this season, there are obviously concerns that some fans haven't come back since the pandemic, but on the whole, the EFL and the National League are in a really healthy place. It's a real positive. You know, there's more and more games than ever on TV, but people do still want to attend and watch games in person, because there's nothing quite like it. So yeah, don't think that nobody cares about football outside the Premier League, because I promise there are thousands and thousands and thousands of fans every weekend who do care. So that's a real cause for optimism. And then as you kind of mentioned before, innovation, and kind of having got over the worst of things with the pandemic. My second takeaway is basically, football clubs are more reactive and more responsive, and, you know, able to think on their feet and evolve more than we think, even though they're these big historic institutions. And, you know, sometimes people are a bit resistant to change, or people think that people in clubs are resistant to change. Actually, you know, they've been able to navigate quite a lot of big challenges in the last couple of years, and a lot of them are thriving. So yeah, it's not all doom and gloom. There's plenty of reason for optimism. And then finally, I think, just from my work generally, but particularly when it comes to the cost of living and kind of the future of football clubs where finances might be at risk, is just the importance of putting fans at the centre of everything, because everyone wants their club to do well. Everyone wants to reach the Premier League one day. That's the benefit of the pyramid system. But actually, generations and generations of fans will support their local team through thick and thin, whether they like the manager, whether they like the players, whether they like the owner, whether they're winning or losing. You know, 95% of the time, they will always be there. They'll always turn up in whatever way they can. So whether it comes to kind of what the offering is in terms of food and drink, or season ticket prices, or how easy it is to get into the game, I always just think the strongest clubs, the healthiest clubs, are always thinking, how is this for fans? You know, how is it benefiting them? What do they think of it? That sort of thing, because it doesn't work. None of it works without the fans. So I'm always really mindful that they have to be first and front and center of so much of the thinking where it's possible to do that.
Great, amazing takeaways, Nancy, and super valuable. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar. It's been a pleasure to have you as our guest, and I encourage everyone to follow what Nancy is doing, follow The Athletic, and also because there you're writing articles, you're on top of what's happening in football, and that's great. We have your email address here, Nancy, but if people want to get in touch, what's the best way? LinkedIn, or is it Twitter, or where should they go?
Yeah, LinkedIn's great. I'm on there just as my name that's showing on the slide there, or Twitter. I'm just at Nancy Frostick as well. So either of those or email is perfect. Always happy to answer questions and speak to people if I can help.
Sounds great. You have definitely been helpful today. Thank you again.
Thanks.